We are calling on a boycott, divestment, sanctions against Israel as a state and institutions that are complicit in maintaining its regime of oppression, including international institutions, by the way. Why is it so difficult for you to understand that we are colonized, we are oppressed, we're living under apartheid, and we want to end that? It's as simple as that. We are calling on a boycott, divestment, sanctions against Israel as a state and institutions that are complicit in maintaining its regime of oppression, including international institutions, by the way. The boycott is not just against Israeli companies, for example. Actually, most of the BDS campaigns are against international companies, mainly American companies. Caterpillar, Motorola, HP. There's so many American companies that are top priority on the boycott list because of their involvement in our system of oppression. So we're calling on for a boycott in all fields, including academic. BDS is very clear. We call for a full boycott of Israel. However, we work with partners. As I said, context sensitivity is very important. It's the first principle in our operational principles, which means that partners decide what they can do in any given time, in any given circumstance. So we work with partners that boycott one company in Israel, not even the occupation, just one company, like Coat Pink, for example. They have a very successful campaign of boycotting Ahava, a cosmetics company that uses Dead Sea minerals in the occupied territories. Ahava shut down in Japan and South Africa, and they're really having a very successful campaign against Ahava. So we work with partners on very targeted, very nuanced campaigns. That's up to our partners to decide. We do not decide for them, but we're very clear on the three rights. What we ask our partners everywhere is to respect our three rights under international law, because that's not negotiable. Those are the minimal rights without which we do not exercise self-determination, which is inalienable under international law. So that's not negotiable. What's very negotiable, what's very context sensitive and tactical is what to do, what to boycott, how to boycott, and so on. So we do not mind working on that. But having said that, there is no state called the occupation. So even if one were concerned only about Israel's occupation, 1967 occupation, there is no the occupation as a state to have measures against. In the UN, it's the state of Israel that's legally responsible for the occupation, for the settlements. So if you want to hold anyone accountable for the occupation, it's only the state of Israel. It's not the settlements themselves. They did not create themselves. The settlements are not the guilty party. They're manifestations of the crime. The criminal is the state that built them. You don't punish the crime. I mentioned the Dutch sovereign fund, pension fund, a couple of days ago, divesting from all Israeli banks. In fact, in doing so, they've adopted the BDS philosophy of how we work. They did not divest from bank operations in the occupied territories. They could have done that, although it's very difficult, because money is money. They decided to divest from all Israeli banks, because of their operations in the occupied territories. In other words, they said, you as banks are responsible even if part of your operations are illegal. You are responsible for that, so we will not deal with you until you end your violations of international law. Now, your question may imply, shouldn't academics be exempted, maybe, if I understand you correctly. Maybe a boycott should be applied to everyone except academics. And maybe if I want to be generous, maybe the implication there is that Israeli academics are more progressive than the rest of society. They're the bastion of the fight against occupation. Aren't you shooting yourselves in the foot by boycotting academics? We heard that question before. Well, first, we're not boycotting academics. We're boycotting academic institutions. As I said, the Palestinian academic boycott does not call for individual boycott. It calls for institutional boycott. So we're not calling for boycotting any person, just the institutions, the systems that oppress us. Second, why are you assuming that Israeli academics are any better than the rest of society, which has shifted way to the far right? There's no empirical evidence whatsoever about Israeli academia being any more liberal or progressive than the rest of society. It's just as bad, and I would say even worse, because they know. They have the knowledge. They know what's being done. They participated in the theories, in the research, in the racism, in creating the doctrines and the ideology that sustains our oppression. So they're extremely guilty, much more than most, much more than Israeli farmers and Israeli workers, and so on. And in fact, just a last anecdote to answer your question, 4 Jewish Israeli academics in 2008 started a petition calling on Israeli academics to sign it, that calls on the Israeli authorities to allow access to education institutions by Palestinian students and academics. Simple. They did not even call them occupied territories because they did not want to offend. They said this is a neutral petition just calling on the Israeli authorities in the West Bank to allow Palestinians access to their education institutions. And they sent this petition to all 9,000 Israeli academics, thinking that an absolute majority would agree because it's basic academic freedom. Only 407 signed, out of 9,000, signed this minimal request for academic freedom. This is completely misunderstanding the BDS movement and mixing positions of individuals like myself with a movement. The BDS National Committee, as I said, is the largest coalition in Palestinian society, including all political parties, trade unions, women's unions, everyone. Almost all of them support 2 states, almost all of them. But in this coalition, in the BDS National Committee, we don't take a position. We're absolutely neutral. We're categorically neutral on this issue. We say that 1 state, 2 state, 5 states, regardless of the political outcome, as a human rights movement, our 3 basic rights must be met under international law: ending the occupation, ending racial discrimination, and the right of return for refugees. Regardless what the political solution is, our rights do not get extinguished just because there's a 2 state or 3 state or 1 state. In any state solution, there has to be respect for international law and our basic rights. So we absolutely do not take a position. Each one of us, as individual activists, has his or her position. I've never shied from expressing mine as an individual, not as a representative of the movement, because I can't. As an individual, with my other hat, I've always advocated a secular democratic state where everyone has equal rights. We understand, including farmers and workers, all trade unions are part of the BDS movement. We understand that there's a price to be paid to achieve freedom. That was the case always. In Alabama, in Johannesburg, and in Palestine. It's the same. We've got to pay a price to achieve our freedom. And Palestinian representatives of the entire Palestinian society have come out and said, we are ready to pay that price. It's worth it to achieve our freedom. So I think hurting the Palestinians, I would say, ask us, don't decide on our behalf. We're Palestinian. We struggle against our immediate oppressors. We stand in solidarity with all the oppressed around the world, but we cannot struggle instead of others. South Africans did not call for ending all injustices everywhere in the world. They supported the struggles against all injustices, but they called for ending their apartheid because it's their apartheid. Why is it so difficult for you to understand that we are colonized, we are oppressed, we're living under apartheid, and we want to end that? It's as simple as that. We stand with all the oppressed of the world, but we cannot spread ourselves so thin to fight on every front in the world and forget our immediate oppressor. The negotiation question, that does BDS negatively impact the possibility of negotiation? Well, let's see what Israeli leaders are saying, like Tzipi Livni, like Yair Lapid. Main Israeli, the most rational, there aren't many left in the government, they're all fanatic right, but those who are a bit rational are saying that the boycott is growing. Livni, a couple of days ago, said BDS is growing exponentially. And she's, I think, the smartest person in the Israeli government. And she's saying that unless we reach an agreement with the Palestinians, the Israeli economy will suffer tremendously. In fact, she used a very strong metaphor. She said the Palestinian conflict is the glass ceiling of the Israeli economy, and that Israelis are living in a bubble, not seeing that the whole world is increasingly isolating them. So smarter people in the government in Israel are seeing that BDS is extremely effective, and in fact are using BDS to say, we've got to reach an agreement with the Palestinians. Now, the negotiations, so-called, which I call negations, not negotiations, because they negate Palestinian rights, those imposed by Israel and the United States on trying to impose it on us, that ignore our rights under international law, will never pass. They will never pass. We will never accept anything less than our rights. What's happening in this country in the last year and until now, we're seeing the taboo being broken. Edward Said called it the last taboo in America, criticizing Israel, the very last taboo in America. We're seeing, I wish Edward Said was still with us today to see that taboo being broken before our eyes. Yes, boycotting Israel remains very controversial. Let's not mistake about that. But it is no longer taboo. At the MLA, it was discussed in a panel, and the opposition was forced to be civil. Rational, no, they were not, but civil. And it was an okay discussion to have in an academic environment. No one died, no one, Chicago did not collapse because we discussed this. So I think we're seeing this mainstreaming happening before our eyes. I would not count on elected officials, not yet. We've got to do, there are no shortcuts in such campaigns. We've got to build the movement from the grassroots up. There are no shortcuts. Those elected officials only serve themselves. And once they see, as we've seen in Britain, for example, with many, many campaigns against city councils, when they see a critical mass of voters ready to dethrone them if they did not take the right decision, then they listen to us. No moral argument whatsoever will ever convince them. Thomas Friedman, no else, said that Congress is bought and paid for by the lobby. So if Thomas Friedman reached that conclusion, this means that we have a lot of work to do to get to the point of affecting Congress. So I'm not big on lobbying Congress because I don't think they lack the knowledge and persuasion only. There's no political will, and they run on funding, which comes from interests that do not support Palestinian rights, basically. Corporate interests, military industrial establishment, Zionist interests, Christian and Jewish Zionist interests, and so on. So Congress will not suddenly wake up and become moral. Neither did it during the South Africa struggle. I personally was active in the South African anti-apartheid movement, and I know Congress was last on earth to become moral, to take the right decision. After we did a lot on campuses, in churches, in synagogues, in unions, and so on and so forth, then the pressure reached a critical point, and then Congress changed. So we cannot expect Congress to be swayed by nice letters that are moral and very persuasive letters. They couldn't care less. They never did. I think it's a complex question, and it's a combination of factors. There isn't just one factor that makes the United States stand so blindly, so dogmatically behind Israel at a time when, I mean, I'm traveling in the US, when your infrastructure is really being undermined, deteriorating. Why are billions being spent on wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan and Israel when this country needs it for education, for job training, for environmental, I mean, you name it. This country is lacking so much. This big, fat empire is crumbling from the inside. You go to the inner city communities, and it's crumbling. Why can you spend $4 trillion on wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, when you need the money here? And why send billions to Israel? It's a combination of things. First and foremost, I think, it's not the Jewish lobby, the Israeli Zionist Jewish lobby, nor just the Christian fundamentalist Zionist lobby. That's certainly a very, very important factor. It's that and the interests of the military establishment in the United States, the military security establishment in the United States, which is the largest lobby. Forget the Jewish or Christian Zionist lobby. I mean, those are peanuts compared to the real big fat lobby in the United States, the military security establishment. They've got the big bucks. Look at the Pentagon's budget, and it's just astounding. That lobby has an interest in a state that wages wars as a matter of habit. Every few years, it wages wars. That's great for business. If you're in the business of death, of weapons, Israel is great. It does your bidding. I mean, it tests your weapon on subhumans in Gaza, in Lebanon. They're always testing US weaponry on us, the guinea pigs. And then the Pentagon can go and sell those weapons elsewhere and so on. So that's the biggest lobby that's maintaining this sacred relationship, no light of day between the US and Israel. But that's not the interest of the US as such, because there's no US as such. There's the 1% and there's the rest of the people. It's certainly not in the interest of Americans at large to continue to perpetuate this colonial system, this oppressive system that Israel comprises. Yes, the Christian Zionist lobby is certainly larger in numbers than the Jewish Zionist lobby by far. I mean, there's no comparison in terms of numbers, but not necessarily financial clout in Congress yet. But that's a huge lobby, definitely. Millions support the Christian Zionist right. But not all evangelicals are Christian Zionists. Let's not make that confusion. Most evangelicals are not Zionist. Evangelicals in this country are about 70 million. I mean, it's the largest denomination if you put them together. The absolute majority of them are not Zionist. Well, the Zionists are 8 to 10 million, as I hear, which is huge still, but they're not everyone who's evangelical is a Zionist. It's very important to educate, especially among Jewish communities who don't know how racist, how anti-Semitic those Christian Zionists are. They are interested in gathering the Jews in the state of Israel so that when the Messiah comes, they'll convert to Christianity or die. And then Israel clearly says, okay, we'll wait for the Messiah together, but in the meanwhile, help us against the Palestinians. You know, Israel is very principled. So that's the biggest threat to Jewish communities everywhere, is this Christian Zionist, very fundamentalist, very anti-Semitic, very racist ideology. In fact, and yes, we should not belittle their influence, not just against Palestinians, against every progressive cause in this country, against the environment. I mean, they say it's okay to destroy the environment because maybe Armageddon will come earlier and we'll be saved. Just sick. The entire myth of Zionism is that the same people were expelled 2,000 years ago have a right today to go home. The same people. I mean, that's the myth. According to Shlomo Sand and many other Israeli academics, it's a myth. But regardless, I mean, the claim, whether it's a myth or not, the claim is 2,000 years ago they were expelled and therefore they have a right today. Not a right to go back and establish their homeland in a way that does not oppress others, displace others that are really living there today, not 2,000 years ago. Just imagine the immorality involved, that we're insects to be disposed of, not humans that they can possibly share a land with. Ireland, South Africa, in fact, supports the issue that we're advocating. Ultimately, they're living together in equal rights. They're living together. I mean, the Protestant community in Northern Ireland had to give up its ethnic privileges, its religious privileges, and to accept equal rights with the Catholics, ultimately. In South Africa, the Afrikaners had to give up white privilege and accept to be equal citizens with the blacks. Only when it comes to Israel is equality not just a bad word, it's an existential threat, literally. Existential threat. And I have many, many quotes from Israeli Supreme Court judges and others that consider full equality as an existential threat to the state. And as I always say, if equality is a threat to Israel, what does that say about Israel? there's no way the Israeli government or the Israeli leaders will wake up and suddenly become humanistic and view us as humans. Neither was it the case in France, in Algeria, Afrikaners in South Africa. I mean, oppressors, colonizers never humanize their victims because otherwise they will undermine the whole ideology on which their oppression is based. Unless you view those others as less human, you cannot commit the egregious crimes you commit every day against them. If you think of them as humans, you cannot kill them so easily. You cannot ethnically cleanse them so easily, demolish their homes so easily. You've got to consider them a bit higher than insects, but definitely lower than humans. Otherwise, you cannot do that to them. So I don't think BDS is sufficient to get it through their heads, Israeli leaders' heads, to treat us as humans, but it's certainly very effective in forcing them, not persuading them, for compelling them to start seeing that pressure will only grow. And this week, as all of last year, they're feeling this pressure extremely intensively. And they know that if they continue this racism, this colonization, this apartheid, and this dehumanization of the Palestinians, they will get only more pressure. So as I said, the more sensible, the more rational ones among them are saying, let's do something before it's too late. In most colonial situations, the colonizers always thought of themselves as enlightening, the natives, us idiots that need white enlightenment. And therefore, if they have to commit a massacre here and there, they were obliged because we just don't get it. So they're always retaliating because we're dumb, we don't get it, so they've got to kill us every once in a while to teach us a lesson. This was done against blacks in this country, in all such oppressive situations, it's done. And I think the struggle, the resistance, especially more ethically compelling forms of resistance that are very targeted against the system of oppression, not against anyone who's innocent, will force the discussion to change, will force the debate to change. But as Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, and Frantz Fanon, the theoretician about the oppression and resistance, said, it's never the oppressed that initiate violence. The very fact that there's oppression means there's violence already initiated. So if a slave hits back at the master, even if the master did not hit him or her first, does not mean that the slave initiated violence. Slavery is violence. So those of us who are really keen on ending violence must end the root cause of violence, which is oppression. Then you end the oppression and the retribution to oppression, the resistance to oppression. No, but within those who claim to support Palestinian rights, obviously, yes. Yes. And we were very vocal in our response. Last year, it was, a number of Palestinian intellectuals and activists signed a very strong statement condemning anti-Semitism and condemning any expression of anti-Semitism and saying clearly that we do not consider anti-Semites our partners in struggle. Regardless what they may come out and say that they support the struggle for Palestinian rights and so on, because this is not an opportunistic movement. We're principled. We are opposed to oppression and opposed to racism everywhere. How can we deal with racists in our ranks? It would just violate our very core of principles. So this is not something that we're saying conveniently to appease a few Jewish activists, as we were accused, by the way. Some of the anti-Semitic individuals that we criticized came out and said, we are getting funding from Soros, who's Jewish, and we're saying this to appease a few Jewish activists in the BDS movement. We're not getting any funding from anyone, let alone Soros. I mean, he would never support us, and we would never approach him to support us to start with. And B, we don't appease anyone. We heed our own principles. Either we're morally consistent or our movement is worth nothing. If we lose sight of our moral consistency, we collapse. I mean, the odds against us are enormous. It's the US with Congress against a small human rights movement that started very small and today is growing, it's mushrooming around the world, and they cannot stop it. They've tried every trick in the book and they cannot stop it. A main strength is we have a near Palestinian consensus. A second strength is our moral consistency, that we very persistently in Arabic and English and French and all languages stand against every form of racism and racial discrimination. So we're very, very categorical about that. And we have no problem coming out vocally against anti-Semites who try to speak on our behalf. Palestinians, like Black South Africans, living under oppression with Israeli IDs, who pay tax to the Israeli system of oppression, to the apartheid state, have no choice but to use the services of the oppressor. Mandela went to a university that's an apartheid university. Where else could he go? Either leave South Africa or study at an apartheid university, because all universities in South Africa were apartheid universities. In Israel, all universities are involved in the system of apartheid. But Palestinians in Israel have no choice. Palestinians who hold Israeli IDs have no choice. As taxpayers, we are entitled to all the services that we can get, health, education, and so on. Yes, there's discrimination in all these services, but that's our only choice. So there's no moral inconsistency in the oppressed not being able themselves to carry out a full boycott of their oppressor because they're in a captive situation, while calling on the world that has a moral choice to boycott the system that oppresses them. I'm one of the few who are still optimistic, believe it or not. I mean, despite the turmoil, despite all powers playing games in Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Yemen, Syria, you name it, Bahrain, and so on, I'm still optimistic because I think for decades, the Arab publics have been completely marginalized, completely submissive to despotic regimes, and finally they went down to the streets in force to ask for their rights. Now, they will be manipulated, yes. Foreign forces will play a major role, yes. But once a slave smells freedom, it's very hard to put them back in the cage. That's what I believe. And I think the Arab masses have smelled freedom. They've seen what freedom looks like, although they have not attained it yet. Nothing will put them back. So I'm seeing a transition. We're passing through a very difficult, bloody, in some cases, transient period. But I'm still optimistic because I'm counting on the masses, not on the regimes. So I think those Egyptians will not be silenced again. Those Tunisians will not be silenced again. And that's very important per se, for their own sake. The part of your question about how will that affect the Palestinian struggle for justice, I think only positively. Because those despotic regimes were Israel and the United States' best friends in the region. I mean, the most despotic regimes, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Mubarak, Ben Ali, and so on, are America's best friend in the region. So we got rid of some of them, some remain, but certainly a more intense democratization in the Arab world will only benefit not just the Arab peoples, and I'm using Arab in a non-ethnic sense, because there are many non-Arab minorities in the Arab world, but also will benefit the Palestinian struggle, I believe. So it's a moral obligation. So I don't have to see exactly what shape or color the light at the end of the tunnel looks like. I have to believe it will, I will see the light one day. Most importantly, acting to see it faster. That's what matters.